In the last lecture, we added the with class higher order component. This, just like the HOCs component, is a component which essentially wraps the props children, so the part within the opening and closing tags, and adds something, like in this case, the div. Now, this is one way of doing that, but we can also write the with class higher order component differently. We can name it with class with a lowercase w, and for that I need to delete the old one first. And this is also just one of the conventions for this kind of higher order component, which is used a bit differently, as you'll see in a second. And here, I'll now create a constant with class, but this time this is not a function which takes the props, but a function which takes some configuration, like the class name. And then this will return a function which receives the props and which will in the end then render something, like render a div with class name equals class name. So the argument we got up there. And we will not only get class name, I expect another argument too, the wrapped component. And the wrapped component will actually be used in here. Wrapped component, a self-closing tag. There I will import React from React to be able to write this JSX code and then export a default of this with class function. Now keep in mind, this with class function is not a functional component. It's a normal JavaScript function which expects two arguments, which then returns a function which qualifies as a functional component. This one here. Now what's the idea behind this approach? Let me show you. We have a valid JSX code here where we are wrapping a component, but now we can use this a bit differently. We can go to our app.js file and get rid of this wrapper, which of course will throw an error. So for now I will use my auxiliary component then, import it from the aux.js file. So I will wrap this with basically an invisible tag. That is what auxiliary does, right? It just returns the children. It doesn't add a real HTML element. And now I will also import this new with class function, and I will leave it with a lowercase w at the beginning because I'm not about to use it as a component, because this function, as I just explained, doesn't qualify as a component. It doesn't return JSX, right? It just returns another function. So now here I'm going to import this from the HOC folder with class 2. And now I want to use with class, but I don't use it in my JSX code. I'm not going to wrap anything with it because again, it doesn't qualify as a component. Instead, I wrap my app here. I'm exporting with it. I'm wrapping this with the with class function. And I'm passing app as well as classes app to it. So the CSS class I want to assign. These are the two arguments the with class function expects. It expects the component it should wrap and the class name. Now with this in place, let's also work on the person.js file, where we still use with class, which doesn't exist anymore. We deleted this. So let's import with class here from the new with class file, lowercase w. And let's also wrap this with this auxiliary component. So with aux here, let's wrap this too. Let's wrap aux. And then use with class just as we used it in our other app.js file here. Let's use it by wrapping the person function we're exporting with class. So person will be our wrapped component, and the second argument should be the class we want to attach. In this case, person. Make sure all files are saved, and now go back to the application, and it should work as before, just fine. However, it doesn't. Click this button, and it looks on the first look as if it would work fine, but you see that all the dynamic elements, all the props on the persons are missing. The name, the age, we can't type, or we can type, but it doesn't update. We don't get an error, but the props are missing. Now, generally, our higher order component here is working, and this is a pattern you will often see. If you plan on changing your component like this, wrapping it, or doing some other transformation with it. One thing you should never do here though is manipulating the wrapped component. Just use it as we do here. Don't start adding or changing its state or properties. And as a side note, you're not limited to returning a functional component here. You can also return a stateful component. Now let's find out what's wrong with these props before we have a look at this stateful component being returned here though. We'll have a look at both in the next lecture.